Hey, this is OminousGiggle, and this is week 2 of the Video Dev Blog. Let's get this show rolling. Just so you know, the Video Dev Blogs will be uploaded to my Patreon a week before they show up on YouTube, so if you're wanting to get an earlier look at what's going on, you can check it out there. My Patreon is OminousGiggle, and there is a link to it down in the description. You can also find me on Twitter at OminousGiggle and see things that I post there throughout the week. So from here on out, the Video Dev Blogs will be a fair bit shorter, just because I don't have to do all the backstory explanation of what's going on in my life and all that jazz. This week was spent focusing on getting a bunch of procedural generation set up for my game, primarily focusing around dungeon generation. For anyone who doesn't know, procedural generation in a gaming context is basically getting the game to build the content itself instead of me having to hand make every possible variation. The first chunk of my week was spent reading mountains of documentation and following a few different tutorials to try and figure out some different proc gen methods, what they're good for, and all that jazz. This included things like cellular automata for things like top-down caves, Bresenhams, which feels like a really fancy line drawing algorithm, flood fills to determine space of shapes and mazes, room perturbation, binary space partition, and more. I found a common problem amongst most of them, or more than likely just a problem with my own brain, and that is that many of them are great for the typical roguelike dungeon flow of room, corridor, room, corridor, room, corridor, rinse, repeat. But I was struggling to figure out how I could procedure generate rooms within a set space, and then have a single occasionally branching corridor that travels along all of them, similar to what you'd have in a house or a mall. Binary space partition and room perturbation were the closest I found, but after bashing my head against them for a couple of days, I wasn't really getting anywhere with it. There were a couple research papers and discussions that I read that dealt more with procedural floor plan generation for buildings, and while they're interesting, I was definitely having some struggles trying to convert the information contained into functional code. I will likely try again at a later date, but for now, I wanted to get something up and running and operational so that I could progress forwards. During my searches, I stumbled across a video by RealTutsGML from like 7 years ago, where they were describing procedure generating dungeons in GameMaker Studio 1.4. They were using tiny sprites that have their pixel information converted over into room layouts. So basically, if there's red, spawn an enemy. If there's yellow, it's a floor. If it's black, it's a wall, so on and so forth. I was able to utilize this thought process to create small sprites for my corridors, which could then generate rooms at specific locations. These rooms would then grow up to whatever size they could, and then iterate across the whole setup to remove or resize overlapping rooms, create walls around the outside boundary, and then with another pass, generate obstructions within the rooms, all utilizing this same kind of method. Once that was done, I do a final pass based off what's already in the room to generate my items and my enemies. Because all this happens when first in the dungeon, it does take a little bit longer. It takes a couple seconds to create everything, but then it's done and no more of that code has to run for that dungeon. The whole setup at the moment is super simplistic, but it works and I can expand on it with new variations fairly easily. My next steps are to create scripts and rules to determine what kind of room each one is, and filling it with applicable objects. This would be both to determine the physical obstructions like shelves, couches, tables, and etc. for each room, but also to start controlling the spawn chances of different items within each room. So, as an example, a bookstore would have a higher chance of spawning blueprints, but a lower chance of spawning ammo. I'm hoping to get that system spun up over this next week and have a few core room types as my premise for my MVP before I move to start trying to tackle multiplayer. Ugh. Still dreading that can of worms. Uh, but yeah, that is today's dev blog. Thank you for tuning in. Have yourselves a great night. Like, follow, subscribe, ring the little bell, all that jazz. And I hope to see you all next week. Bye.